If you were standing in front of me right now, you'd probably burst out laughing just like those young French aristocrats did back in the day. Look at me, a scrawny wild boy, barely over 1.60 meters tall. My hair never quite stays in place, and the cuffs of my military uniform are frayed from wear. Whenever I open my mouth, a thick, salty Corsican country accent tumbles out. Yet in your history books, I am the god of war riding a white horse across the Alps, the emperor who snatched the crown from the Pope's hands to crown himself. But today, let's toss aside that magnificent velvet coronation cloak. I want to show you how, long before becoming that Napoleon, I struggled in the mud and swallowed my first mouthful of blood-laced spit. In 1769, I was born on the island of Corsica. What kind of hellhole was that place? A desolate island whose gates had just been blasted open by French cannons and forcibly annexed. My family was supposedly of fallen nobility. Sounds pretty impressive, right? But the reality was that this so-called noble title could barely buy a few clean loaves of bread. In the eyes of the French, we were nothing but a bunch of uncivilized country bumpkins. When I was 10 years old, my father made a decision. He sold off all our family's valuables and even swallowed his pride to beg others, all just to squeeze me into the cabin of a ship bound for mainland France. The sea wind in Corsica was fierce that day, the salty spray lashing my face. Father gripped my shoulders, his fingers trembling slightly from years of anxiety. Staring intently into my eyes, he said to me, "Napoleon, remember, in this world, only knowledge can bridge the chasm of social class. Go to France, learn their skills, and bring them back. Don't be like me, rotting away on this island for the rest of your life." Carrying this expectation that felt almost like a curse, 10-year-old me was tossed into the Brienne Military Academy in France, like a cheap provincial souvenir. Those were the coldest days of my life. It wasn't the weather that was cold, but people's hearts. Can you imagine the scene? In a dark, damp Gothic corridor, a group of impeccably dressed young French aristocrats wearing expensive perfume, surrounding a short, dark-skinned foreign boy. They mocked my clumsy French pronunciation, mischievously twisting my name Napoleon into straw in the nose. They kicked mud into my food tray and poured cold water on my bed. Was I angry? Of course. There were several times I clenched my fists so hard that my nails dug deeply into my flesh, wishing I could rush over and tear out their throats. But I didn't, because I knew that winning a fight would only buy a brief moment of peace, or result in getting expelled from school. It wasn't these idiots I wanted to defeat, but this damned fate. I locked myself in the library. While those noble young lords were embracing girls and flirting at balls, I was grinding through calculus under dim candlelight. While they were racing horses in the garden, I was covering scratch paper with artillery ballistic trajectories. Like a parched sponge, I greedily absorbed every drop of knowledge from my books. Geometry, history, geography, artillery tactics. I treated these dry symbols as my troops, orchestrating massive military campaigns in my mind. My silence became my most impenetrable armor. They could laugh all they wanted. I just kept taking first place. While those who mocked me scratched their heads in frustration over their exam papers, I had already delivered a resounding slap to their faces with my flawless report card. But it seemed the heavens felt my trials weren't enough yet. When I was 16, a letter with black mourning edges was placed in my hands. My father, the man who always told me that knowledge transcends class, had passed away from stomach cancer. He left behind no inheritance, no protection, only a widowed mother and a brood of crying, hungry younger siblings. That night, I walked alone to the military academy's training ground. The pale moonlight shone on the cold bluestone paving. I didn't cry. Tears are a luxury only the rich can afford, and I didn't even have the right to be sad. I gazed at the pitch-black night sky in the distance, feeling that something inside me had completely died, while something else was breaking out of its shell, carrying the scent of blood. It was in that very year that I graduated early from the École Militaire in Paris with exceptional honors, and was commissioned as a second lieutenant of artillery. At the commissioning ceremony, I put on the officer's uniform that was finally mine. Although the fabric was coarse and looked somewhat comical on my small frame, when I rested my hand on the hilt of the sword at my waist and felt the cold, rough touch of the brass cannon, my heart was surprisingly calm. The times are undergoing a drastic upheaval, and the faint scent of gunpowder from the Great Revolution already lingers in the air. Others enlist for the glory of the king or the romance of chivalry. But not me. Standing in the ranks, watching the dust kick up ahead, I have only one thought in my mind. I must survive, and I must put food on the table for my family far away in Corsica. To secure my next meal, I will turn this world into my battlefield. Have you ever smelled the streets of Paris in 1789? It was a mixture of cheap tobacco, rancid bread, and a thick, nauseating stench of blood. That year, the heavy guillotine fell in the Place de la Révolution, and the noble head of Louis XVI rolled into a wooden basket. That dull thud not only severed centuries of French feudal monarchy, but also struck like a heavy club, shattering the sweet dreams of royal families across Europe. Across the Rhine and the Alps, I can smell the panic radiating from the monarchs of Europe. They are terrified, afraid that this fire called revolution will reduce their velvet thrones to ashes. Thus, Britain, Prussia, Austria, those kings who usually schemed against each other, suddenly became as close as brothers, cobbling together a massive anti-French coalition army, pouncing on France from all directions like a pack of hyenas smelling blood. And me? At that time, I was nothing but a shabby artillery second lieutenant who had to pinch pennies just to buy a new pair of leather boots. A country bumpkin from Corsica, short in stature and speaking with a heavy accent, I was nothing but a joke in the eyes of those impeccably dressed aristocratic officers in Paris. But they don't understand that when the entire world is collapsing, true opportunities are often hidden within the smoke of the ruins. What do you think war is? Wearing ornate uniforms, lining up in neat formations like knights, and tipping hats to one another before opening fire? No, that is the romance of those old men in wigs. In my eyes, war is a cold, precise, and extremely cruel mathematical calculation. The French army on the front lines is being steadily beaten back by the coalition forces. The soldiers have no winter clothing, no rations, and even the rifling in their gun barrels has been worn smooth. I stood in the muddy trench, looking at those desperate young men. I didn't have time to give them an impassioned speech. I only knew that to win, the rules of the old world had to be completely shattered. They treated artillery as mere accessories to the infantry, scattering them across the battlefield like sprinkled pepper. I refuse. I gathered every piece of artillery I could find. When I close my eyes, my mind is filled with trajectories and parabolas. Artillery is the god of war. I will forge them into a clenched fist of steel and smash a bloody hole right through the enemy's most vulnerable defense line. I divided the infantry into battalion-sized tactical formations. No longer a rigid linear formation, I want them to be as agile as a wolf pack. The artillery will tear apart the enemy lines with cannon fire, and under the cover of smoke, the infantry will drive in like wedges. And then my cavalry. I didn't have them execute any flashy charges. Instead, I turned them into the sharpest scalpel on the battlefield, using maximum mobility to cut off the enemy's retreat the very second their ranks fell into chaos. Under my baton, the infantry, artillery, and cavalry functioned together like a precisely geared war machine for the very first time. During those days, I nearly forgot what it felt like to sleep. My uniform was permanently caked with indelible mud and the stench of gunpowder. When I emptied my boots, nothing but bloody water poured out. In the combat against the anti-French coalition, I was like a desperate gambler, wagering the very destiny of France on the table. 6 life-and-death major battles, over 70 skirmishes big and small. Can you imagine the scene? While the old Austrian generals were still in their tents poring over military manuals from the last century, I had already led my mud-soaked French troops through the thick pre-dawn fog right under their noses. When my hundreds of cannons fired in unison, shattering the tranquility of the morning, I watched the panic in the enemy positions through my spyglass. Those Austrian soldiers in their snow-white uniforms fell like a field of wheat swept down by a gale. At that moment, the artillery fire cast a red glow across my face. There was no mercy, no hesitation. This is a war of the New World, and I am the sword-bearer of this new world. We won. The French army turned the tide from the brink of despair, driving the arrogant coalition forces off French soil. Famous from a single battle, newspapers began using such flamboyant words to describe me. In the streets and alleys of Paris, people no longer spoke of the guillotine. They began chanting a single name, Napoleon Bonaparte. It was a late autumn evening when the high-ranking generals of Paris signed their names on a letter of appointment. I stood before the dim, full-length mirror, looking at my reflection. Still the same modest stature, still the same pale, gaunt face from chronic sleep deprivation. Yet pinned to my shoulders were the general's stars, exceptionally granting me the title of Commander-in-Chief of the French Army. That year, I was only 25. 25, an age when so many others were still drinking away their heartbreak in taverns or worrying about next month's rent. But I already held the sharpest sword of the entire French Republic in my hands. I raised my hand and slowly fastened the top brass button of my collar. Outside the window, the Parisian sunset was as brilliant as blood. I knew this was only the beginning. Monarchs of Europe, your nightmare has just descended. 1797. Your history books might only record this year in cold numbers, but in a dilapidated, perpetually drafty kitchen on the outskirts of Vienna, this was the year I, Franz Schubert, opened my eyes to the world for the first time. You call me the king of songs now, placing me in magnificent gilded concert halls, having maestros in crisp tailcoats play my music with their eyes closed in absolute ecstasy. Give me a break. If you time-traveled back to that era and bumped into the real, living me on the streets of Vienna, you probably wouldn't even buy me a glass of the cheapest dark beer. To be honest, I wasn't much to look at. I was extremely short, only 1.57 meters, stout, with a protruding belly, and my friends teasingly called me Little Mushroom. I am severely nearsighted, with a pair of thick, round glasses perpetually perched on the bridge of my nose. I don't even dare to take them off when I sleep, because I'm afraid that if inspiration suddenly strikes in my dreams, I won't be able to find a pen in the dark. I don't possess Beethoven's rebellious madman aura that could scare away aristocrats. I am just a timid, subservient fat man who can't even afford rent. Vienna is a man-eating place. Beethoven is here. He is the sun, a god. And me, I am a rat in the sewers. I have no money, no steady job, and not even a piano of my own. Every day, my biggest worry wasn't how to compose a symphony that would go down in history, but where my next bowl of potato soup would come from. Can you believe it? That lullaby, the one that can now quiet the entire world, the one countless mothers use to coax their children to sleep, was written by me on the back of a menu in a noisy little tavern. I sold it to a publisher for just enough money to buy a plate of potatoes and shredded pork. That is reality. The priceless artistic treasure in your eyes was worth exactly one plate of meat in 19th century Vienna. But do you think I was deeply embittered, complaining every day about the unfairness of fate? No, I was as happy as a madman. When night fell, the freezing winds of Vienna rattled the flimsy windows. Wrapped in a heavily patched, musty old overcoat, I would rub my freezing fingers and sit before a borrowed piano at a friend's house. The very moment my fingertips touched the black and white keys, the whole fucked-up world suddenly vanished. No vicious landlord demanding rent, no arrogant nobles, no empty stomach. There were only musical notes. Those melodies were like glowing, winged specks of light swarming out from a heart that life had repeatedly ground into the mud. Remember the afternoon I wrote Erlkönig? The cold winter light filtered through the dusty glass, hitting my greasy, unkempt hair. I paced anxiously back and forth in that cramped room, gasping for air. I heard the frantic galloping of hooves in my mind, the chilling whisper of death in my ear, and the agonizing roar of a desperate father in the wind. I grabbed the quill, racing across the musical staff like a reckless gambler. Ink splashed onto my face, my cuffs smudged the paper black, and my wrist ached as if it were about to snap, but I simply couldn't stop. In that moment, I was no shabby substitute teacher. I was a king who held the power of life and death. It was a love letter to this cruel world, written by the gods through my hand. But fate never favors the pure. As if keeping me in poverty wasn't enough, it had to claim my life as well. In my 20s, I contracted syphilis. In that era, this was a stamped death sentence. My hair fell out in handfuls, and it felt like tens of thousands of ants were gnawing inside my bones day and night. I was confined in a dark, damp ward of the Vienna General Hospital, breathing in the pungent smell of medicine and the nauseating stench of decay. Friends gradually stopped visiting, and the girl I loved had long since married someone else because I was poor. I was all alone, staring at the mottled mildew spots on the wall, listening to the wails of patients in the corridor. Did it hurt? Of course it did. Was I afraid? Terrified to death. Yet, as my flesh decayed day by day, heading toward an irreversible ruin, the fire in my heart burned ever brighter. Dragging my diseased body, I wrote down Winter Rise, Winter Journey on paper. I arrived a stranger I depart. When I penned these words, the heaviest snow Vienna had seen in a century was falling outside the window. Looking at my pale, trembling hands covered in red spots, I suddenly felt completely at peace. The world handed me the worst possible script, leaving me impoverished, ugly, lonely, desperate, and destined to die young. Yet I did not strike back with curses. I chewed up all the pain, betrayal, cold, and hunger, swallowing them down with my own blood. What I ultimately breathed out was the pure, flawless Ave Maria and the soul-piercing unfinished symphony. 1797 to 1828. 31 years. That is the entire measure of my life. Too short, isn't it? So short that I didn't even have the time to hear most of the symphonies I composed. So short that when I died, I couldn't even afford a decent coffin and was hastily buried with just a few old clothes. But so what? Now, no matter where you are or what you are doing, close your eyes. Listen. Can you hear that melody playing? No matter what kind of messy chaos you're going through right now, no matter if you, like me back then, have been backed into a corner by life and feel like you can't hold on any longer, please find a warm corner in my music to rest for a while. I am Franz Schubert. In my entire life, I hardly ever had a truly full meal, but I have left the entirety of heaven to you. December 2nd, 1804. The bells of Notre Dame de Paris are ringing so loudly they give me a headache. What you see in history books and in David's famous massive oil painting is the Emperor of the French wearing a magnificent velvet cloak enveloped in a divine halo. You all thought that in that moment, I stood at the pinnacle of the world, my eyes brimming with the arrogance of power. But if I were to pull open this heavy crimson velvet right now and let you touch my undershirt, you would find it already drenched in cold sweat. December in Paris was as cold as a freshly sharpened bayonet. I stood on a red carpet embroidered with lilies, the air thick with a nauseating mix of cheap incense and the cloying perfume of thousands of aristocrats. The smell made me sick. It reminds me of more than 10 years ago, beneath the guillotine during the Revolution, the same bloody fanaticism emanating from the frenzied mob. Listen, the citizens of Paris outside the door are cheering madly. Long live the Emperor! Long live France! The sound is so familiar. A few years ago it was this very same crowd, using the exact same voices to cheer as they chopped off the head of Louis XVI. Now they are screaming themselves hoarse for me, their new master. This is reality, absurd, comical, yet bloodily real. I slightly turned my head, catching a glimpse of Pope Pius II seated on the high platform out of the corner of my eye. That pitiful old man, draped in elaborate vestments, looked like a marionette dragged onto the stage against his will. In his hands he held the solid gold laurel wreath, waiting for me to step forward, kneel at his feet, and accept the so-called divine right of kings. Kneel? I, Napoleon Bonaparte, a country boy from Corsica, a short man mocked since childhood by Parisian aristocratic youths as a Corsican bumpkin due to my heavy Italian accent. Why should I kneel to a pope who couldn't even defend his own capital? You later generations always loved to portray me as a madman drunk on power, but you know nothing. In a Europe dominated by the old aristocracy, bloodline obsession, and kings, if I did not become a wolf, I would have been eaten alive. My crown was not bestowed by God, let alone handed out as charity by those fools in silk breeches. I seized it amidst the endless artillery fire of Toulon, choking on the acrid smoke of gunpowder. I forged it step by step through the blizzards of the Alps, treading over the frozen corpses of mules and soldiers. I pieced it together from the piles of the dead at Marengo, using the severed limbs of my own men. The crown of France had long fallen into the mud. It was I, Napoleon, who picked it up with the tip of my dirt and blood-stained sword. I took a deep breath of the freezing air inside Notre Dame, and the wildly pounding heart in my chest suddenly grew still. Under the gaze of thousands of eyes, before the canvas where David was about to strike his brush, I strode toward the Pope. I could clearly see the astonishment and fear in the cloudy pupils of Pius VII. His frail, twig-like fingers trembled slightly as he prepared to recite that lengthy Latin prayer. I didn't give him the chance. I reached out with both hands and snatched the heavy golden crown directly from his grasp. 12 pounds of pure gold, cold, hard and grating against my skin. I turned around, turning my back on the so-called spokesperson of God, and faced the empire I had conquered with cannons and bayonets. The great hall instantly fell dead silent. I could even hear a few old nobles in the front row gasping in shock. Watching the candlelight reflect off the golden crown, I raised it high above my head without hesitation and thrust it heavily onto my own head. At that moment, there were no miracles, no divine voices. There was only the cold touch against my scalp and the faint protest of my neck bearing the heavy weight. Is this the weight of power? It's fucking heavy. But then my gaze fell upon the woman kneeling at the bottom of the steps. Josephine, my wife. She looked absolutely breathtaking today. A white silk gown trailing across the floor, a golden crown framing her still exquisite face. Yet, only from this close could I see the unhideable fine lines around her eyes and the slight tremble of her shoulders. She was a widow, a courtesan, a pitiful woman who survived the turbulent times by selling her smiles and her body. All of Paris laughed at her, and my family wished they could eat her alive, claiming she was unworthy of being the Empress of France. But I understood her, just as she understood that poor Corsican boy on the Italian battlefield who wrote her sentimental love letters night after night, yet whose heart was filled with fear and a profound sense of insecurity. In this magnificent Notre Dame, a place teeming with calculation and betrayal, she was the only one who had ever seen me strip off my armor and weep like a child. I picked up the slightly smaller crown and descended the steps. I didn't let the bishop do it. Instead, I bent down myself. "Don't be afraid," I whispered to her in a voice only the two of us could hear, my French still carrying a hint of a Corsican accent. Josephine looked up, her eyes, which had once captivated all of Paris, now brimming with tears. She looked at me, not seeing an emperor, but rather the reckless and passionate artillery lieutenant who had once knocked on her door on a rainy night. I placed the crown firmly upon her head. At that moment, the cheers from outside surged into the grand hall once more like a tsunami, rattling the stained glass windows. Artillery salutes roared. All of Paris was descending into a frenzy for their emperor. I slowly stood up straight, turned around, and swept my cold gaze across the nobles and ministers prostrating on the floor of the grand hall. I know these cheers are fake. I know that if I am ever defeated, the very people kneeling here today to kiss the tips of my boots will not hesitate to send me to the guillotine tomorrow. I also know that this crown, which I placed upon my own head, will ultimately become a curse, dragging me into endless wars until my last drop of blood is drained. But so what? I am Napoleon. Even if the freezing, snow-covered Moscow lies ahead, even if it is the desolate island of St. Helena, even if the ending is destined to be destruction. At least for this second, I am France. You always see me in oil paintings. Yes, that specific one, Napoleon crossing the Alps. In the painting, my cape billows in the wind like a defiant red flag, my warhorse rears up high, my finger points to the clouds, and my eyes are filled with a conqueror's arrogance. But honestly, if a painter were to truly capture the most unforgettable scene of my life, they shouldn't use red and gold. They should use only two colors, a dead, silent white and a despairing black. Now, close your eyes and forget that invincible French emperor in your mind. Come with me and step into the Russian wasteland of November 1812. Do you hear it? That is the sound of military boots crunching through half a meter of deep snow. Crunch, crunch, sounding just like death chewing on bones. The cold wind slashes across my cheeks like a razor, and my hands are so frozen I can barely grip the horse's reins. I look back. Behind me, crawling through the blinding blizzard, is a ragged, dark line. A few months ago, this black line was nothing like this. It was the summer of 1812. I stood on the banks of the Niemen River, the sunlight striking the golden eagle standards of the French Imperial Army, so dazzling it blinded the eyes. A grand army of 650,000 men. It was a massive war machine, unprecedented in human history. I looked at those young faces, the buttons on their chests polished to a gleam, their bayonets like a forest of metal. I thought I held the very throat of Europe. With a single command, they would drag even God's throne back to Paris for me. What did I want? I wanted to completely shatter the British Empire's trade blockade. I wanted to mold all of Europe into a colossal empire that answered only to me. And Alexander I, that Russian Tsar, issuing orders from St. Petersburg, was my final stumbling block. Defeat him, and Europe is ours. That is what I told my soldiers back then. But I only guessed the beginning. I completely failed to anticipate the unforgiving temper of this land. I had expected a glorious, decisive battle like Austerlitz, both sides drawing up their battle lines, my artillery and cavalry tearing their defenses to shreds, followed by their surrender on bended knee. But the Russians did no such thing. They slipped back like eels, drawing my iron fist into a massive ball of cotton. They retreated, endlessly retreating. Along the way, there was no food, no wells, not even a single bundle of hay left for the horses. They burned their own villages to the ground and poured poison into the water. Leading 650,000 men, I was like a mad lion charging into the desert. The more I roared, the thirstier I became. It wasn't until September 14th that I finally stood outside the gates of Moscow. The light that afternoon was dim. Sitting on my horse, I adjusted my collar, waiting for the mayor of this ancient capital to present me with the city keys and surrender. But there was nothing, absolutely nothing. The entire city was dead silent, like a massive tomb. That night, standing by a window in the Kremlin, I finally understood the Russians' answer. Fire, roaring flames soaring into the sky. It started as a mere spark, and then the entire night sky over Moscow was scorched blood red. Billowing waves of fire rolled through the wooden architecture, and thick smoke blotted out the moon. Black ashes fell upon my shoulders like snowflakes. That was Moscow, the heart of the Tsar, yet he had ignited the inferno himself. I stared at the sea of flames through the window pane, the glass scalding hot to the touch. In that instant, a piercing chill surged from the depths of my heart. I wasn't facing a mere army, but a nation of madmen who would rather carve off their own flesh and burn it than let me take a single bite. We had no supplies and no winter clothing. We waited in these ruins for a month, but the Tsar's letter of surrender never came. The Russian winter, however, arrived ahead of schedule. Retreat, I gritted my teeth, issuing the most humiliating order of my life. The journey that followed was a slow death by 1,000 cuts. The temperature plummeted to -30 degrees. Have you ever experienced that kind of cold? A cold so deep that even the sense of pain vanishes. My soldiers, those same young men who had once shouted "Long live" beneath the pyramids and charged into battle at Marengo, were now reduced to tearing off rags to wrap their frost-bitten toes. There was no food. At first, we slaughtered the horses. Later, even the bones of the dead horses were boiled into soup. I saw with my own eyes an old soldier sitting in the snow, cradling his rifle in his arms, staring blankly straight at me. I walked over to pull him up, but the moment my hand touched his shoulder, he toppled over like an ice sculpture. He was dead, lacking even the strength to cry for help in his final moments. The snowy ground was littered with abandoned cannons, frozen corpses, and those golden eagle military standards that once represented supreme glory, now half buried in the snowdrifts like trash. And just when we were at our weakest, looking like a horde of beggars, the Russians launched their counterattack. Cossack cavalry emerged from the blizzard like ghosts. They avoided head-on clashes, merely taking a bite out of the tail of our marching column, tearing off a piece of flesh before vanishing again. With every gunshot, another of my elite Imperial Guards fell. Blood splattered onto the white snow, blindingly red, quickly freezing into black ice. Sitting inside the carriage, listening to the agonizing screams outside, I clutched the hem of my greatcoat in a death grip. I am Napoleon. I am the god of war, yet now I am powerless. I can only watch this white wasteland, like a giant coffin, swallow my empire piece by piece. 650,000 men marched in, and those who made it out alive with me at the end were barely a fraction of that number. Now what drifts through the blizzard is not just the sound of Russian gunfire. I close my eyes and hear the stirrings from afar. In Berlin, in Vienna, in London, the kings and emperors I once crushed beneath my feet are beginning to circle like vultures catching the scent of blood. They are gathering, forming a new anti-French coalition, determined to tear me completely to pieces. I lost to the Russian winter and to my own boundless ambition. But I open my eyes, stand up from inside the carriage, and push open the door, letting the blizzard whip against my face. I look at the ragged, hollow-eyed remnants of my defeated army around me. "Straighten your backs," I roar at them, my voice hoarse in the driving snow, yet still the voice of an unquestionable emperor. I know I am surrounded by a pack of wolves ahead, and I know the era that belongs to me may be collapsing. But until I draw my last breath, I remain Napoleon Bonaparte. Even if I must step down from the pedestal, I will show them what a magnificent blood-red blaze the twilight of an empire can ignite. You always assume that the concept of accepting fate does not exist in the emperor's dictionary. The version of me you see in oil paintings is always riding a majestic steed, pointing toward the Alps with a red cloak billowing arrogantly in the wind. But today, I want to speak to you from the bottom of my heart. Stripped of that imperial robe embroidered with golden bees, I, Napoleon Bonaparte, am really nothing more than a gambler who has lost all his chips yet refuses to leave the table. The story must begin with the late spring chill of 1815. Back then, I was confined to the Mediterranean island of Elba. Euphemistically, it was an exile. In harsh reality, it was taking this lion who once tore half of Europe to pieces, pulling out his teeth and locking him in a cage for a public spectacle. That night, the British officer guarding me had gone to a ball. I stood on the reef, the sea breeze whipping my hair into a mess, the salty smell of the ocean piercing my nose. I patted my slightly plump belly and asked myself, "Napoleon, is this it for the rest of your life?" No, I refused to accept it. Gathering 1,000 scraped-together old comrades, we squeezed onto a few battered boats like a band of stowaways and sneaked back to France under the cover of darkness. Do you know what the craziest part was? When I set foot on French soil, the troops sent to annihilate me had their rifles aimed right at my chest. I unbuttoned my gray overcoat and stepped forward into the dark muzzles. "Shoot, if you want to kill your emperor." For a moment, there was a deathly silence. Then the roar of "Long live the Emperor" shattered the clouds. Those rugged men dropped their weapons and knelt before my leather boots, weeping like children. As for that Bourbon king sitting on the throne, hearing of my return, he packed his bags overnight and fled faster than a rabbit. Just like that, I took France back into my grasp without shedding a single drop of blood. However, the exhilaration of returning to the pinnacle lasted for merely 101 days. Reality is no fairy tale. Behind the miracle lay a battered and broken nation. I sat at my desk in the Tuileries Palace, the candlelight stretching my shadow on the wall, rendering it withered and distorted. France was too exhausted. Years of war had drained the country's blood, and the treasury couldn't even scrape together enough money to buy new shoes for the soldiers. And what of the monarchs of Europe? They were terrified. The Seventh Coalition descended upon me like a massive iron net. I had to fight, and I had to win. June, Belgium, Waterloo. It was a place where even God himself seemed to be against me. The night before the decisive battle, the rain poured down in torrents. By the next morning, the battlefield was nothing but dark, sticky mud. My cannons were bogged down in the mire. The heavy cannonballs struck the soft, slushy ground without even producing a decent bounce. I sat on the camp stool, cold sweat soaking my underclothes. My stomach twisted in agony as if I had swallowed a handful of broken glass. My body had been failing for a long time, and my waning energy terrified even me. I narrowed my eyes, gazing at the distant horizon. I had entrusted my most elite cavalry to Ney and the task of pursuit to Grouchy. But Ney, like a madman, threw away the cavalry for nothing against the enemy's squares, and Grouchy, that rigid fool, never showed up on the battlefield where I needed him, right to the very end. 70,000 exhausted young Frenchmen clashed head-on with 120,000 well-equipped coalition troops. I watched with my own eyes as my proudest old guard, the scarred veterans who had fought alongside me across Europe, fell in rows before the dense musket fire. Blood dyed the mud of Waterloo dark red. The thick gun smoke choked me and stung my eyes, but I did not look away. At that moment, I knew my time was up. With the final roar of the cannons, the First French Empire completely shattered into a scattering of broken glass. In July of that same year, I abdicated once again. This time, they gave me no chance to turn the tables. I was shoved onto a British warship and dumped on the island of St. Helena in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. It was a wretched place where not even birds would care to linger, surrounded entirely by black volcanic rocks and endless howling winds. I had gone from an emperor who made all of Europe tremble to a prisoner whose mere strolls were monitored by British soldiers. The damp room was covered in mold, and the peeling wallpaper looked strikingly like the map of the battle I had won at Austerlitz. I no longer wear my military uniform. Every day, wrapped in an old nightgown, I sit blankly by the fogged-up window. The cancer in my stomach is devouring my life bite by bite, causing such agony that I can only curl up into a ball on the bed. I often recall the rain on the day of Waterloo and the young faces shouting, "Long live the Emperor," in the mud. It was I who led them to glory, and I who dragged them into the abyss. May 5th, 1821. A fierce storm is raging outside. The sound of waves crashing against the rocks sounds just like the roar of cannons. I lay on the narrow wooden bed, my breathing growing ever fainter. 52 years old might be the prime of life for an ordinary person, but for me, this body had burned down to its very last speck of ash. Before my vision blurred completely, I seemed to see once again that billowing red cape, to see the French fleur-de-lis blooming in the sunlight. I parted my cracked lips and with my last ounce of strength uttered a few words. France, the army, charge. The world finally fell silent. I, Napoleon, was dealt a terrible hand in life, played it into an absolute triumph, and ultimately lost it all. But I was here, I fought, and I made the world remember my name forever.